I thought I read it. All right, so today, thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Beau Larkin, who's deep in a distracting conversation with Dan.
I do know him, he was my TA.
Awesome. All right, so Beau is a project and property manager at the MPG Ranch, which is a non-traditional ranch in western Montana. It's not, doesn't have a production agricultural focus. But he's going to demonstrate what their focus is, how they go about restoring and conserving rangelands in Intermountain West. All right. So is that suitable?
That's absolutely great.
All right. Thanks, Beau.
Here's a view of MPG as it looked for about 5 minutes this winter. That picture was 2 winters ago. So restoration, research, conservation, I'm going to get to those things. As I was putting this together, I started thinking more about kind of historical context. So we'll be talking about the past as it applies to the present on this property a little bit. And so what is MPG Ranch? The kind of small talk answer if I meet somebody and they just want to know what's this place about. It's a privately owned wildlife sanctuary funded by a family foundation. So we work for a family who has a philanthropy based on conservation. They fund all the work that we do, and we strive to reflect their values as we carry out this mission on the landscape. So I know at the moment that this is going to sound like we don't have a ton in common here, and this is my first talk with a agriculturally focused group. I hope we'll be good friends though, and I think by the end of this, I hope to convince you that we actually have a lot more common than you might think. We face similar land management challenges, just for different outcomes. So also this isn't a small talk situation, so we're going to look into what my little boilerplate sentence of our vision statement would be here. But the couple of key terms to notice, so it's privately owned, so that the company is private and the land is private, which ultimately gives us a lot of possibilities sometimes that we might not get in a public setting. A lot of our work, a lot of the research and restoration that we do is facilitated by our collaborations with people here, with the University of Montana, with agencies, and with some of our neighbors. And we have the flexibility to do some things and move rapidly on projects, which is nice for them. Wildlife sanctuary, so the family's conservation value is really to kind of maximize the peace and quiet, kind of small W wilderness of this landscape. So when we're implementing projects, whether it's a restoration or research, we kind of try to maximize the peace and quiet, which is important in especially Western Montana. And I think here too, with the increasing human encroachment, recreation, subdivision, exurban development, this is a place where we have peace and quiet for the animals that live there. So where am I talking about? And we, as a group, we actually manage 2 properties. MPG North is where we started about 20 years ago. That's in the Swan Valley near Condon, Montana. It's 200 acres, former industrial timberland. The flagship ranch, this is what we'll be talking about today. We started that in 2010. Florence, Montana, just a little bit south of Missoula. And let's get an aerial view. So it's 16,600 acres now. You can see which one's the laser? Yeah, this is the south extent of Missoula City right there. And from the aerial view, you can see the grassy, the kind of southwest area, the grassland there. That was the original purchase of 6,500 acres. It was a Schrader, last called the Schrader Cattle Company, but this was in cattle grazing land ownership since the 1880s. So for 120, almost 130 years, continuously grazed, among other uses we'll get into. And then all of the forested acreage you see there was almost all of that was former industrial timberland, a little bit of state that was disposed. And we bought that in phases. So over several years, we assembled this whole property, or rather the family I work for assembled the property. Just to have an oblique view of the place. So our western border roughly is the Bitterroot River floodplain at 3,200 feet elevation, and then going up 6,000 feet on Mount Baldy. And this view really emphasizes the kind of habitat change with elevation. So at the lower elevations, we have our grasslands and the heaviest impact area of the cattle companies through a band of range, shrubby range, big sagebrush and bitterbrush. and then up into Ponderosa Park, and finally Dry Music, Douglas Fir Forest. So we have a lot to work with here. And if you've heard of MPG at all, I'm going to guess that some of the things that have made the most reach in terms of kind of media products and stuff have been our charismatic big animal, charismatic megafauna projects. One here, my colleague Joshua Lisbon has long been researching and documenting mountain lions. We have a game camera image here. And 2 years ago, we had this wildlife documentary tracking notes about our work with mountain lions. And this went to some film festivals and won some awards. But really the emphasis here is that what made this video possible was 10 years of work by Josh and his team of tracking these animals. And so what this kind of highlights from our perspective, so first, that wildlife sanctuary, we try to do this project without disturbing the animals. So we do this by tracking and passive collection of tissue, hair and scat for genetic analysis, and lots and lots and lots of camera work. And this documentary itself, part of what made it popular and notorious at the time, we don't think the mountain lions were aware of our presence. I mean, even the high definition camera work was done with autonomous units. And so I think that kind of made it appealing. So with this sort of project, we're able to maximize this wildlife sanctuary element. But the other thing we have here is that because of our funding and because of the family's interest, it gives us the opportunity to do long-term projects that may have academic focus. So we do publish papers. We have backgrounds in ecology and biology, most of us. We're all naturalists. But oftentimes the family wants to see other products that come out as well. And so if we have the opportunity to do a decade-long project that has various products, we're able to do that. And so we can bring in various collaborators depending on what it is we're trying to achieve. And we can do things that go beyond a typical grant funding cycle. Another thing you may have heard of is our work with birds. And so the family is, I would say that the family's favorite animals are birds. They like all the wildlife, but they really are bird focused. And that could be raptors, that could be ducks, that could be songbirds. But we have long documented and dealt with raptors at the Bitterroot at MPG Ranch. And we've always emphasized kind of getting reality and nature read in tooth and claw in our photography. So we've got a golden eagle chick devouring a Colombian ground squirrel there. Always a fun kind of thing to see. We started working with Rob Dominich. I think I've got a picture of him in here somewhere, but of Raptor View Research Institute. And he's spent his whole career documenting and counting migratory golden eagles and viewing golden eagle conservation. He thought that the Bitterroot Valley was likely to be an important migratory flyway for raptors. No one was watching it. MPG Ranch would be a good place to watch it. So we decided to fund that. And we started counting raptors every fall and spring. And so again, with this idea that we can do a long project and spend a lot of time observing to help us come up with questions and find a way to get at a problem, we started noticing that indeed this is a great flyway and we're able to count raptors. And then think about what can we do for raptor conservation with our little chunk. 16,000 acres in the middle of the West is nothing for a golden eagle. What can we do? But again, as private land, we can put out these roadkill animals as bait stations to capture raptors, trap them, and then we can ban them, fit them with telemetry or tracking devices, take blood samples, depending on the species, whatever it is we want to do. Questions we're motivated by. And of course, everybody loves raptors, so it's easy for us to get people involved. You'll never forget if you handle a golden eagle. So this is a great outreach and conservation opportunity for us. But over time working with Rob, there he is, our buddy Rob Dominich. Now this work that I'm going to show here, this isn't MPG's work. Rob and his, this is some Craighead Institute people, Brian Bedrosian and others that have worked on golden eagle conservation for a long time. We've contributed some funding and staff time and support for this project. But one thing that Rob started to notice when we're fitting golden eagles with GPS backpacks on them is that we start to get densities of flyways. And it's interesting here. So everybody knows birds fly south for the winter. Well, our golden eagles fly north for the summer. We're the winter range for a lot of these birds, which is kind of an interesting twist of things. But we really started to get concerned with our eagles that we see just for a short time in the winter. What happens to them the rest of the time they spend? We have no idea where they are. And one thing Rob started to learn in his whole research group through this is that golden eagles prefer a very specific wind condition that is the optimum wind condition for wind energy development. It's not too much wind, it's not too little. The Rocky Mountain front is a perfect spot for both. And so if we want to help policymakers decide where's a bad place to put wind turbines that are going to whack the golden eagles, Rob and his group developed kind of density estimators like this, of where the golden eagles are most likely to be in defining these migration corridors. So that can be something that's important to us, and it makes us feel good as a group doing a conservation project. And we think it also has species conservation and policy implications. So we like to be involved in a nexus like that. And then probably a lot of you, when I brought up golden eagles and blood tests, a lot of you I bet thought lead. That's kind of a big issue right now, is lead toxicity in raptors. In the conservation world, it's been an issue for a long time. I'd say at least 20 years that we've been documenting elevated lead levels in birds. And that's alarming. But from a policy perspective, if you want to get into this arena that has to do with ammunition, guns, and hunting rights and this kind of stuff, you have to do a lot of science to kind of show what the situation is. 10 to 20 years ago, the real leading questions in this arena were, how are the raptors getting lead into them? And so the research at the time was really, I think today is conclusive that this is coming from hunters. When they shoot an animal, the bullet fragments and gets into the guts, which are then usually left in the field. In the wintertime, eagles are scavengers primarily, at least in the Intermountain West, and they consume these lead fragments and suffer either acute or lethal toxicity. So that was the story back then, was how are they getting the lead? And we think that the evidence is very strong that that's how. And rightly so, in a policy situation, what you want to know is this just mortality affecting some individuals, or is this a problem for the population? You know, if you're going to advocate for some kind of policy change, that's a fair question. And so that's where this research has gone now. And again, it's a big research group that MPG is, you know, if anything, tangential to. But we've been very impressed to see this happen, is that we're starting to be able to piece the story together and show that the declines in golden eagles that we've witnessed sort of on a continental scale, those declines happen for a lot of reasons. And then when you add lead toxicity to that, there is a measurable effect on the demographics. So this is something we've been watching very closely and will continue to. If any of you went to the recent Wildlife Society meeting, you might have met Mike McTee. He was awarded there. This ties into the raptor eagle story. I'll get there. But this is kind of, again, with our luxury of kind of leading by observation and starting long-term projects and looking for opportunity. Mike's a great example of this. So when we first started MPG Ranch, we had this shooting range that had been run for generations. And their lead contamination in the ground had created these slickets with no plants could grow. And so Mike's background was environmental science and chemistry. And so his task was to figure this out and propose a remediation plan. He did that. But along the way, just on the ridge above the shooting range was where we were doing all this raptor monitoring. He became enamored with these with eagles. And so he shifted his research focus into questions that are all around this issue of the lead toxicity. So not the birds themselves, but he's done a ton of work in ballistics. What bullets and bullet types are more likely to fragment? Which ones are more likely to create lead problems? Are there other animals, like small mammals, that are scavengers that can be affected by this? There's a camera study and a few projects that have come out of that. And then finally, he wrote this book, Wilted Wings, which is part memoir of his experience and feelings about this issue. And then it's also a sober, fact-based account of the situation. What do we know about this lead and ammunition issue? what are a variety of ways that we can navigate through this and produce some better outcomes. And so at MPG, through our ownership, we were able to kind of facilitate his writing this book and taking the risk there, try and publish something. And how cool is that, right? Writing a book and publishing it, that's awesome. It's like, I don't know that I would imagine myself doing it. And then my colleague just up and does it. It was so neat. Another big project, which I'm not given to self-promotion, but I'm coming here and with Lance in the room. By the way, thanks for inviting me. Real pleased to be here. It was easy to say yes. We're involved, and I'm the point person at MPG on our sharp-tailed grouse reintroduction. Of all the animals that thought to be present in Western Montana when Lewis and Clark came through, this is the only one that's currently missing. So we're bringing them back and to MPG and also to a couple of sites in the Blackfoot Valley. Here we see a transmitted bird looking through a spotting scope that's just been released onto new ground. And again, these sorts of things with us give us the opportunity to involve others in some really fun and inspiring conservation work. So here we just have people assisting us in processing birds and getting them into release boxes so that we can then let them go and hope that they nest and produce offspring, which some of them are. And we'll be beginning our third year of this project, releasing birds in about a month here. So these guys on the bottom here, this MPGer, Chuck, and Jeff brought his little girls in to see birds, and then this is a volunteer up at Blackfoot. So those are, I feel like if people have heard of MPG, it's often these kind of big animal things, and and we're big nature buffs and that kind of thing. But really, that idea of wildlife sanctuary isn't just about grizzly bears and mountain lions, right? I mean, it's 16,600 acres sounds really big, but from the perspective of a golden eagle or a grizzly bear, it's not. There's limits to what we can do for these large animals. And when we think about the preserving nature at MPG, we're really thinking about ecological process, structure, and function. And so for that, we need the whole food web from the bottom up. I mentioned that the ownership is really into birds, and that's every bird. And we run a big bird program. Kate Stone, our ornithologist, instrumental in this. We do some work on species of concern like Lewis's woodpeckers, kind of fire forest obligate species that have been declining, telemetry work on them, learn more about where they go and what they do when they're not at MPG. Eric, my good friend for a long time, is a licensed hummingbird bander. Wouldn't think you'd have to have a license for that, but they're really fragile. You can't handle a hummingbird without a lot of training. And we learned that the same individuals come back year after year for many years and allow themselves to be caught often in the same week. It is amazing that, you wouldn't think a hummingbird would make it back to the exact same spot. Same thing with this house wren. This house wren is at least 7 years old at this time. And we do bird mist netting. So we catch birds on breeding grounds in the floodplain and measure them and count them and all kinds of stuff every year. This is a partnership with the University of Montana Bird Ecology Lab. And we have a number of these little songbirds that migrate tremendous distances, and we get them every year for 7, 8, 9, 10 years. Amazing. And there's several ways that we look at how to use birds to document success or failure of our restoration work, which I'll get to that in a minute. So birds are a response variable for us, but they're also just conservation concern in their own right. So we have kind of a mix of organismal biology and ecology questions that we get at with birds. And then we spend a lot of time thinking about pollinators, and the plants they need. Grasshoppers, those of you in here who manage grass know that people don't think about how much of the plant community grasshoppers eat. It's a lot, and in some cases it rivals what any of the mammalian grazers eat. We think a lot about grasshoppers. They feed things like this deer mouse, which we also think about. These things eat the seeds that we try to plant for our restoration projects, which is a problem. We think a lot about coyotes because we have several home ranges. So we have a collared study with coyotes. I don't have time to talk about bears and show videos of bears scratching on rub trees and stuff. You can find all that on our website. It's great. I don't want to compete with it's like you'll never be able to pay attention to me if I put a scratching bear up here. But we have lots of coyotes, and so it's kind of like with the black bear study and the mountain lion study. We have the opportunity to study their social dynamics and also investigate how they're filling and using the landscape. With the coyotes in particular, after a couple of years of doing this, we find holes in places where we think they should be. And then we start finding illegal trapping, or we find other things where people are trying to harm these animals in places where that is unnecessary. So in a way, it's kind of monitoring what's happening with this situation. And then within our own property, they eat stuff that sometimes we care about, so we just keep an eye on them. And then finally, the Snickers bar of rangeland. Here we have a ground squirrel. Everything eats them. We need to have a lot of them because we want to feed ground squirrels. We want to feed coyotes. We want to feed all these things. How many ground squirrels are there? Where are their colonies? Are they expanding? We keep track of them for sure. So again, if you've heard of MPG, you've heard that we're a bunch of wildlife lovers. But really, if we want to have them, as I've mentioned, it all starts with our plant community. And so this is a breathtaking montane grassland. This is the top of Mount Baldy at MPG Ranch. And at its peak in mid-June, who wants to go there right now, right? This is the most beautiful thing. Unfortunately, at least half of MPG is this. So I mentioned it was a cattle company for a long time. And you could wander around for a long time in this couple hundred acres you see here and look for native plant species, at least in the herbaceous layer. We have exotic annuals, exotic perennials, exotic forage grasses, range grasses that have been planted, and the shrubs that have difficulty expanding, especially anything that isn't sagebrush, because when they get started, they just get browsed immediately by ungulates. So when it comes to, we're notorious for all the birds and the wildlife projects. Most of our time and money and thought goes into how we fix this. And so that's where I hope to connect back to this group and say that we have elk grazing, we have animals that rely on this landscape that we're trying to provide for, and it's our grassland health that matters the most. And I think that's one thing we have in common. So as we think about, again, we have this vision of this wildlife sanctuary. Our mission sort of becomes, how do we provide the greatest good for the greatest number of wildlife species? And there's a lot of ways that you could do that. We could do some kind of a zoo model, right? That would be a good sanctuary, but that's not what we want, and that's not what the family wants. So if we want to provide this greatest good for the greatest number, what we have to do is understand ecosystem process and the ecology of Western Montana, so that we can understand the process, structure, and function that existed in the past, and then looking out in the present, what is available to us that we can leverage to maximize that greatest good for the greatest number. Can you tell how much I rehearsed that? Failed. So we need to do a little bit of some history here. We need to do a little history so that we can understand what our options are. And the history of MPG Ranch in these Western Montana valleys starts with Glacial Lake, Missoula. I don't know how hot a topic that is and how much that comes up in Bozeman. So I'll go fast through this, but 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, end of the ice age, we have this ice dam here. Ice sheet expands and it blocks all the water that's melting out of these glaciers from Western Montana. And it makes this lake, it's unfathomable size, 2,000 feet deep. And the conditions would warm up, the ice dam would retreat, the lake would empty and fill again. This happened many, many times. And there's a little controversy over the biological richness of Glacial Lake, Missoula, but the consensus seems to be that this was not the tropics, right? This is a very cold, deep lake, biologically poor, very low nutrient sediments, not a ton of life in here. So while the lake is full, we're getting deposition of nutrient poor silts. Here's an oblique view where I tried to get cute and make a bathtub filling in where the lake is, but that's pretty close to the line of where it was. And so during the deposition, we're accumulating nutrient poor sediment in all this grassland area down here. Meanwhile, the upland areas were vegetated, continuously vegetated, accumulating wind-borne deposits of silt That's where our best soil is. So this is a little unusual to have our best ground up high and our poor ground down low. And then when the lake would empty, this first. When the lake would empty, it created these huge erosion events. It emptied fast. It was an enormous catastrophe, the emptying of this lake. It washed all of eastern Washington into the ocean. It would be these massive erosion events that would leave deep piles of alluvial gravels. So this is a road cut, but it's still cut into the soil that existed there. And I would say this is a soil profile, but it's not a soil profile. There's no weathering, there's no sorting. This is nutrient poor gravel, extremely fast draining, does not hold water very well, and nutrient poor. So this area, this low area on the ranch is mostly very full or highly erodible soil. Any of our surface water that originates up high, the moment it hits those gravels, it goes subsurface. So we really don't have surface water on the grassland except for a couple of springs. This blue line is that pool height. So this is now the lake is gone after the last time it receded. So why would I go through all of this, geologic history of the Pleistocene? It's very consequential for us today. First, this plant community had to reassemble after the lake vanished for the last time. But what would it assemble from? The plants around it are these montane, pretty wet, nice soil plants. Most of them are not going to pass the abiotic filter to be down here. I kind of tried to find a way to put this on a slide. It was hard, so I gave up. But just across the valley, we have Lolo Peak, which is over 10,000 feet, very broad. It's 4 miles away, the peak of it. This is the rain shadow of Lolo Peak. So our grasslands here get 8.5 inches of rain a year. Uplands get 15, and even Missoula City gets 13. So 8.5 is marginal for even a grassland community. So any plants from these upland areas are going to have to pass that filter, poor soil, no rain. And then the plants that we did have historically, the native plants we had, are a convergence of Palouse prairie and Great Plains prairie species. But think of how far they had to go to get in and disperse and form this community. They had to cross either the entire Bitterroot Range or come from from here, basically. That's that dispersal filter in the species. And we know from historical records that plant species richness in Bitterroot grasslands is sparse. So 12,000 years is not a long time to develop soil and to assemble a plant community from few species. So what we end up with at the end of the Ice Age is a fragile plant community that's very susceptible to disturbance with erosive soil and with a lot of space available for invasive weeds. So we'll come all the way to the modern era. I don't mean to hand wave over millennia in there, but the human history of 10,000 years ago in the Bitterroot Valley is just not my expertise. It'd be interesting. But the next kind of data point we get is Lewis and Clark. So in September 1805, they hit Ross's Hole in extreme southern Bitterroot, maybe 400 Salish with 500 horses. And as Clark always did in the journal, these ratios. So men to women and children, men to horses. And it's always tempting. There's a lot of books that try and do these historical reconstructions. How many Salish were there? How many horses do they have? What did they do? There's tribal oral history too. Trying to back calculate from those ratios to how many Salish were there, I don't think is really that important. There's not going to be universal agreement. But I think that what seems defensible and conservative to say is that before the old world plagues that were apocalyptic for native people, in the Bitterroot Valley, we would have had 1,000 to a few thousands of people and thousands to a few thousands of horses for a very long time. Why would I bring this up? This was a working human inhabited landscape providing grazing resources long before Europeans got there. This place was worked hard. Next, we move into the European settlement era. Nice C.M. Russell painting to make it so idyllic. I don't think this era was quite idyllic. But it was what it was. The open range era, especially in the Bitterroot, is late 1800s. The McLean family were the three brothers that were sort of the barons, at this time. They assembled all this land. They packed the Bitterroot Valley with sheep and cattle. this went on, and I'm gonna fly through some of this. This will be very familiar to most of you anyway. I paused though on the dryland wheat era because it's maybe the most consequential 5 years in the whole history of what's now MPG Ranch. So the Dust Bowl, you're all familiar with the Dust Bowl, and the whirlwind explanation of that is that World War I destroyed Europe's economy and industrial capacity. They're very hungry. The price of wheat globally goes through the roof, and Americans rush to capitalize and feed the world. So the answer to this was to till up everything and plant it to dryland wheat. This did not last very long, and it failed for at least 2 reasons. One being that they overproduced and crashed the market, leading to what we know of as a partial cause of the Great Depression. And then most of the areas they tilled up weren't going to work for dryland ag, and they didn't really know what they were doing that well yet. So this land was all abandoned. Much of it was abandoned, and creating these big dust storms and loss of soil, and what some people have called one of the greatest environmental catastrophes in Earth's history. That might be high, but it was a big catastrophe. So this is underappreciated in the Intermountain West. If you go into the Bitterroot Valley, every slope that you could get a tractor and a plow on was plowed during this time and planted to wheat. So we had the same problem. It just wasn't the Great Plains scale. And so another thing I think many people in this room will be familiar with is that the government knows they have to respond to this problem. And one response was to develop exotic plant materials, hybrids. Crested wheatgrass is maybe the most notorious, that they could plant here that would just hold the line, keep the soil in place, and provide some forage resource. That is what this 5 years, and crested wheatgrass is what comes back on this. But anyway, continuing this history. So post-World War II, the culture shifts. Sheep give way to cattle. We have hay production. And then over the years, the Schraders, who were direct descendants of this McLean family, they were the last cattle company at what became MPG Ranch. So Bob Schrader, the last owner, he still lives by what's now MPG, and he's great. He's like our mascot. He's always hanging out at the ranch. He's a wonderful person. We learned a ton from him. When he was a kid working for his parents, they were aware of the declining range conditions in the 1970s, and because it had been overgrazed for a very long time, and it's poor ground to begin with. So as he inherited the place and took it over, he confronted a couple of big problems. One, the family now has too many heirs to further split the land. They're not going to be able to hand it down to generations anymore. So Bob made the decision, and this is basically his words. He said, we made the decision in the 90s. We got kids to put through college. We're going to run this place into the ground, plat it, subdivide it, and sell it to developers. And that was their economic choice. At that time, when it was placed for sale, there is no cattle operation on the planet that could have bought it and paid the loan. I mean, the development value of 600 units platted that close to Missoula far exceeds what you could pay. In 2007, Conservation Land Trust bought the place. 2007 is a real bad time to buy something like that. They were bankrupt, and then the family I worked for was able to buy it after that. So the whole point of this history is that this was poor land from the start, from a long time ago, and then it had a long history of heavy human use. So now let's get into the heart of the matter. I've done all this pretty pictures of wildlife and everything. Now let's talk about what we actually do as a group, which is very boring for a talk, pictures of crested wheatgrass. We have 1,200 acres or so of this stuff. Here's just a shamelessly grabbed from the NRCS picture of crested. This is what this looked like in 2010. So crested tends to have a lot of space between it, a lot of dirt, super competitive. The only forb I know of that competes well in our neck of the woods is leafy spurge, which we want even less. So this is what they look like then. And there are many groups in Canada and the US that are working on this problem. Replacing crested with anything better is a huge problem. You have to get rid of the crested first. You can't drill seed into it. This stuff it's too competitive. What you plant won't take. 2013 and 14, we killed it with glyphosate and with burning and some harrowing. And let me tell you, turning 1,200 acres into dirt when it's surrounded by spurge and cheatgrass is scary. And you can see that the birds didn't like it either. So this is density per hectare of 20 songbird species that are either grassland obligate or adjacent. And the density declines through this time because we took 1,200 acres out of any possibility for them nesting or living there. This disturbed the sanctuary. Remember that wildlife sanctuary? We were counting on giving it back to them. That data and work, by the way, is from University of Montana Bird Ecology Lab. And then in 2023, this is what we get back. So it's not all dirt, but we have a lot of plant people in there. And you're looking at this picture, and I hope you're thinking the same thing I am. That's it? Like, that's it? That's mostly weeds. The forbs are weedy forbs. That's the best you can do. This is a colossal 10-year experiment into a very mediocre outcome. But we got all excited. We're like, wait, look what happened to the birds. The density of these same species, it goes way up, and everybody's all excited about that. And me and my boss, Philip, me and a couple other friends were looking at this. We're like, I don't know what those birds were doing, but it wasn't us. It wasn't us that did this. We can look at a few. I mean, those pictures they look terrible. There is a little benefit in there. If we look at some plant data, we look at some plant data, we can see the richness, so native and non-native, blue and tan. We did add a few species, and you see that we added a lot of non-native species. A lot of those were intentional. So we have tremendous difficulty getting native forbs to establish in here. So we have used temporary, what we call bridge species, sandpoint and alfalfa, two of the biggest ones. We planted a lot of coneflower, retivita, plants in the genus retivita are pretty easy to establish. So they're non-native, but intentional. And then there's weeds too. So we've increased the richness a bit. We look at cover. And so first of all, you're going to see the 75% thing and think, what are you guys doing? We use point intercept methods, and I found that they relatively track quadrat methods, but they don't come up with, they usually overestimate what you get from quadrats. So it's just a method thing. Anyway, oh yeah. So we do have increased cover, again, more of our non-natives. We did get some more form, and our native perennial grasses stagnant or declining. That's something we look at as a big failure. It's something we need to learn about. Non-native grasses take a big hit because we kill them, and then they come back, and that's Poa bulbosa and Poa compressa. So these are grasses that weren't really there in big abundance beforehand, and they were able to colonize in just a few years and cover the place. They provide very little benefit. So maybe we have more richness, a little more form, a little more cover. And if we look at some, grassland obligates, so we have grasshopper sparrows and savanna sparrows here. I see an increase like this, and I think that's got to be something going on, either in winter range survival or some other eruption in the population. But maybe it's something to do with us. Maybe there's just enough increase in cover and just enough increase in forbs producing more insects for them to forage during nesting season. Maybe there's something of what we did in there. Savanna sparrows, it's much flatter and noisier data, but maybe an increase. So, we look at this and we think that was an awful lot of difficulty and effort, and we're not seeing what we want to get out of it. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? And I'll sort of get into our next steps coming out of that. But I do want to pause and say that we did try a lot of forbs. So this is the same photo series that you saw before, 2010 to then 2023 down here from the north floodplain grasslands, we call them. And in that middle time, 2015-16, we drill seeded successive mixes of native forb species into here. And the ones that we can establish are the weediest ones. And yarrow is the poster child for that. It's easy to establish yarrow. And that's what you see here. So you see this, it's kind of an ocean of yarrow. And it was magnificent in 2016, declining by 18, and vanished by 2023. And so what we found through some work, I put Chuck Casper here to remind me about that paper, but our colleague Ilva works at MPG, soil scientist, microbiologist, and invasion ecologist. And she was able to put together that this was actually a density dependent effect by soil pathogens. So we had, so much yarrow that was able to amplify some pathogens. We also think that we're planting a cultivar of yarrow, so there's not a lot of variety in this resistance in some way. That's speculative. But we just had a negative feedback from the soil on the yarrow. And I mentioned Chuck before I go into ILVA anymore. So Chuck's current paper that's in review, ILVA's on it too, a bunch of us are, is there a way for us to harness this? And so if you could use a cultivar that's going to have negative density dependence and not hang around too long, could you use it as a bridge species where then it facilitates you introducing some other forms that you do want? And so we're looking at a project to see if we can do that. Meanwhile, ILVA's work partly has helped us address things like soil microbial. So this is the negative effects from pathogens, positive effects from mutualists, and how we can use that in our plant community restoration. A lot of that has to do with weeds and how they end up sticking around. After we got this this problem with the pathogens and the yarrow, there was some later work that ILVA was involved with showing that the nutrient additions in our soils can increase these pathogens. So this turns out to be super relevant. And what ILVA got us involved in is this nutrient network. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. It's a global research initiative in grasslands. And it's many countries. And so that any participating facility, you set up an field experiment with their rules. And it's pretty simple. You have a fenced plot and an open plot. And then within those, you have fertilized and not fertilized. And there's different fertilizer mixes, but basically it's fertilizer. And through that study and then work on MPG is where we found that these fertilizer additions favor pathogens. This turns out to be important for us because remember, this is a super low productivity grassland. And as we're watching our crested project be lackluster, let's just say, there was a growing encouragement within and outside our organization saying, hey, if you're just looking for grassland productivity, maybe you should just start fertilizing the place. Now, most of you in here would immediately think you're just going to have weeds if you do that. And that's what we thought too. But what we found with ILVA's work is that you also get pathogens. So if you're trying to restore with fertilizer, you're going to get weeds and pathogens, and that's going to make your job really hard. But it's not like the job's easy. So now what we want to do is start to figure out how do we get these native forbs to work in this super difficult spot, and not just ones that are ruderal and likely to die really fast, like yarrow. So we work with a good friend of mine and our collaborator, Dean Pearson. He's adjacent University of Montana and Forest Service in the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And we've set up these replicated field trials. So plant people in here, you're going to say, wow, and this is a really nice grassland. This is on a slope that couldn't be plowed. So this is actually relatively nice. We have 5 replicates of this thing. And some of them are in real poor, kind of post-crested areas, and some of them are in nice grassland. And I'll try and just describe the treatments here really briefly. So you see the water tank. So there's a watering treatment in here. There's a big buck and rail fence. So we're excluding big grazers. So we're limiting herbivory there. Inside the buck and rail, we have a machine wire fence like this in part of it, so that we're excluding all grazers except grasshoppers. We got a hand wave there, but so we have full herbivore exclusion, big herbivore exclusion, and then this one here is the opposite. So elk and horses can get into this. They don't really like to, which is a problem, but they can. So this is rodent exclusion only, and then in between is a plot that's open to all herbivory. So our first treatment factor in each block is herbivory by different groups. And why is that important? So rodents are going to eat seeds and seedlings. The big animals are going to eat the plant. Which is more important? Is this more an early establishment problem or a later establishment problem? Within each treatment exposure, we have multiple 2-meter squares in a grid with different disturbance treatments, 2 different plant communities seeded in, so one from a little wetter and one from a little drier, and then half of each is irrigated. So this will help us learn what are the relationship and strengths of the biotic and abiotic filters in this system. Are we dealing with a system where seeds are just simply being consumed and that's it? It doesn't matter if you water it. It doesn't matter which plant community. Or are we dealing with a system where later competition and grazing are more of a problem? This will help us learn what species and what approaches can we use to get some results. And we've had a couple of papers come out on that. And we're looking forward to some more. So, and I think I'll probably just finish with the matrix. I wanted to introduce one of our kind of technologies that we've deployed. We have a couple of web-based modeling tools that we're using within and outside our organization. This is one that we've developed also with Dean Pearson. And I'm afraid that going through this is probably going to leave you with more questions than answers, but I'll try and just deal with the concept and what the point of it is. So we're in this situation where we're trying to restore these grasslands. We kind of need to do it fast, and everything's changing around us all the time. The numbers of elk, the adjacent land ownership, the amount of rainfall we get in a year, and its timing. And then along the way, we're trying to deal with rodent grazing or rodent seed predation, elk grazing. But then we have other people coming in and saying, well, what about seed traits? What about your plant genetics and genetic materials? What's in the seed bank? So there's always all these questions, and they're all plausible in terms of what the outcome is likely to be. Now, if you look at this thing, it's this food web, and we have all these are listed. And I'm not going to try and manipulate. This is just a screen grab. I'm not going to try and get in up here and run this in front of you all. If you were at the lunch afterwards, I can pull it up if you like. But this is a food web, and so there's an interaction strength between each node in this. So it's hard to look at, but it looks like little spaghetti noodles between every single thumbnail on here. So it kind of reminds you of a structural equation model or an integrated population model, except the trouble with those is you have to have great data to build them and use them. You have to know your abundances or populations really well, and you need to exactly know the interactions between them, how strong, which direction. So we built this tool based on a qualitative modeling framework called fuzzy cognitive mapping. And what this allows you to do, if you have good data on abundances and interaction strengths, great, you can put that in. If you have to go to the lit and figure out kind of on average how many pounds per acre do grasshoppers eat, you can use that. And if you just don't really know how many rodents snakes eat in your system, you can make some educated guesses, and you know that that's probably not likely to affect your elk abundance too much, right? You're not going to build something in where snakes tank the system. So there's this process of tuning this thing, and we're starting to use this more and more because, so this is kind of the exemplar. We built this MPG grasslands matrix with kind of every node we think is relevant to our grassland. When we come up with a specific management question, we're not going to include all these species. You know, if we want to know if we can have our grassland birds increase if we double our forb abundance, then we'll build a simpler matrix that just deals with that problem. But what the outcome of this can be is, do you get a strong outcome or a weak outcome? Do you get a strong positive or a strong negative outcome? Then you could think about designing the experiment where you go in and actually model it in a robust, statistically rigorous way. But this allows us to game out situations quickly and think about what it is that we need to do. So as an example, I'll just walk through a couple of shots and then we'll be done. Of one little experiment that I used to demonstrate the matrix. So here we have this kind of set system. And the important nodes here are going to be precipitation at the bottom, so the abiotic forcing, and then elk, and then the plants they eat. And hunters are here as a way for us to have a top-down effect on the elk numbers. By the way, now that I've said hunters, it's going to be on your mind. I don't have time to go into our whole hunting. The hunting program is a big deal at MPG, but we're not outfitters. We hunt cow elk for population management because we have a lot of elk. And we can talk more about how we do elk later. I'm happy to answer any questions about it. So the first thing that we do is we drive the precipitation down. So we drive the precipitation down and we see that the plants all go down. So we have all these red numbers. And they kind of go down equally across the board. But the exotic plants go down more than the native plants. And the hand wavy explanation there would be that the native plants that are here are evolved to tolerate the extremes of this location. But part of the reason this works is that I've also made the hunters enormously effective. 120 kills. That's amazing here. And so we put the elk and deer, we put the big grazers way down. And so we have this effect where all of the plants are hurt by the dry conditions, but the exotic plants a little bit. But if I take the hunters out of the equation and let the elk get really high, the situation reverses, and now the exotic plants are able to capitalize on some of the ground that's seeded by the native plants. And so that you could then think about, and this is that experiment I introduced of Dean's, the exclosures up on the top of the hill. That experiment was designed a little bit around this kind of a result. So we built this qualitative modeling framework. We balanced it, we trust it. Here's the results it has. Now, how would we design an experiment to prove it wrong? So this tool is available on the web for anyone who want to use it. We also try and export it for education. An ecology class, it would be a very useful tool. And so this is something we've been pretty happy with using a lot lately. Like I said, there's a lot to talk about with elk, and I'm happy to go into it at a later time if it comes up. But for now, we got 7 minutes, it looks like, for questions. I'd hope to get 10. But thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Yeah, I had a good question when you were talking about the raptors and like toxicity. So when it's getting to their food network, is it more or less they're scavenging or actively like bullets, or is it the rodents they eat?
Oh, is it accumulating through the food chain?
Yeah.
So this isn't, my answer is not going to be complete because it's not my research. The state of it now is that the overwhelming abundance of lead they're ingesting is from actually consuming the lead fragments. There is maybe some accumulation through the food chain, and I'm not aware of how much research has quantified that. But when have you ever seen an X-ray of a gut pile? I mean, probably not, but this has been done. So people take X-ray, take full gut piles into a facility and X-ray it. When a lead bullet strikes bone or other hard tissue in an animal, it fragments into many thousands of pieces. So it's not big chunks of lead that we're talking about. And when eels are scavenging and gorge on the liver, like they just are swallowing chunks and chunks of tissue. So they're ingesting many small fragments. This is the worst problem imaginable because the smaller these fragments are, the more their surface area to volume ratio is they're going to dissolve and get into the bloodstream fast. So I mentioned that Mike studies ballistics and different kinds of bullets and their consequences. Bullets that don't fragment, which is not typically what you're after as a hunter, but bullets that don't fragment pose much less risk than bullets that fragment aggressively. Does that answer?
Are the symptoms of the lead poisoning easy to spot, or do you have to put blood for them?
They're easy to spot if they're acute. It's a neurological toxin, and so a lot of the early alarm over this issue was people out for a hike and noticing a bald eagle or a golden eagle flopping around on a hillside or in a creek and shaking around and convulsing. That'd be an alarming thing to see, and that's lead toxicity. But when we do these blood draws, Rob has told me this directly. He's amazed sometimes at the lead levels in their blood from animals that seem physiologically normal. So their behavior is normal, they're flying, they're hunting, and they have these huge thresholds. I'm going to hand wave a little bit on the exact number, but in the fall blood draws, so this is one way that we've gotten at bullet fragments in gut piles being the primary vector, is that there's a seasonal component to the lead contamination in blood. Late summer is the lowest, and then December is the highest. So this is when they're, first of all, that's when they convert to scavenging. Secondly, that's when this resource is available. So in these post-hunting season blood draws of many dozens of birds, something like 90% of them will be orders of magnitude over what the government says is safe for humans, and which nowadays has been revised. Now the CDC says there's no, whichever agency There is no safe lead level for human consumption. It used to be 5 parts per billion or so. So 90% of the golden eagles would be an order of magnitude above that or more. Yes.
Kind of a bigger picture question, I guess. I know a lot of this work is done on private land, but thinking about how much public land we have in Montana, like how do you strike a balance between like the human involvement and the human recreation on that land being able to like help? Like, is it better to have, I guess, less human recreation on public lands, or kind of drive and increase the recreation on public lands in order to kind of build support for conservation?
That's an awesome question. That's like a whole,
Yeah.
that
I
would
know.
be a whole class, like a whole semester long class. I love it though. I loved my policy class when I was in grad school, which was a lot about this kind of thing. I mean, the only off the cuff answer I can give you to that is that it just depends so much on the situation. I've been doing this long enough now that I guess what I would say is I still believe in the power of this education, awareness raising, developing conservation value. But I look around sometimes and I see a lot of talk about the importance of these things and behaviors across our society. I'm going to talk about this room, but behaviors across our society that just end up not really reflecting the rhetoric. So I would never give up on encouragement, on conservation, or on the notion that taking our kids out to recreate, fall in love with the land is important. But I just see more people. I've lived in Montana my whole life, almost my whole life. There's just more people and there's more damage and there's more, it's just hard.
Yeah.
Great question. I hope you solve it. I will join you.
I've got one or two. I guess it's a two-parter online from Taylor. So,
Oh, good.
first one is, what large grazers do you think were historically present post-glacial Lake Missoula? And then, how do you annotate all the camera trap images you receive?
I'll start with the second one. Boy, I would love to hand wave on that first one. How do we annotate? For almost all the time that we've been doing this, we just hire people. I mean, it's amazingly difficult to annotate these images. And keeping in mind that we do a lot of this by video. So those projects, Black Bears, Mountain Lion, these projects I was talking about, this is behavior that we're interested in. So we take video. We have been using more neural net, machine learning and AI tools to filter images. So, anyone who's done camera work, you get grass waving around, you get 5 million triggers. We can get rid of those. We can filter out the false triggers. But then the grunt work comes in, even if a computer can put a species on, there's even some work that's tried to put behaviors in. But we have a long list of ad hoc tags that we want to put on these things. And so it's got to be done by a person. As for the grazers, there's evidence and documentation that bison were infrequent residents. They would make forays into the Bitterroot and be there for a short amount of time. We didn't have, American Serengeti herds of bison in the Bitterroot Valley. Other than that, I just don't know. I mean, our complement of Pleistocene megafauna, which who would love to go back and see all of these animals, right? The American lion, dire wolf, short-faced bear, everything goes on and on. The original horse and the original camel on planet Earth are from North America, migrate to Asia. Who knew? It's mind-blowing. I just don't know which ones were specifically in the Bitterroot and when. Yes.
So one of the papers about the matrix, it was using that to look at unexpected outcomes of introducing species. But then you mentioned like removing nodes that aren't important for doing work. How do you know if that node might have had one of those unexpected outcomes that you're using the matrix to predict?
Excellent question. I mean, you never totally know, right? I didn't put the screenshot of it up there, but the paper that Dean and I think I'm even on that one that introduced the matrix. There was an algorithm in there for kind of how you go through and limit your nodes. You can't put everything in because then you'd see essentially end up having dilute effects everywhere, and it's just too much work. So you have to make some decisions about when something is such a weak effect that it's likely to not be relevant. And it totally depends on your system. I will add though that we go to release a tool like the Matrix, it kind of seems like this thing that you can just rig for any answer you want. You could. But there's a way to avoid that. And so the validation tests that we included in that paper that introduced the Matrix were from known closed systems with amazing data. So this is Yellowstone Lake introduction of lake trout, super well-studied system. And another one was the introduction of red squirrels to Newfoundland. And those systems were both amazingly well-studied. So we had this crazy data and we knew what happened. So then we took the data, put it into the Matrix, exactly as it was, ran it, same result. And then we took the data down to really low quality. So we built the Matrix with the same nodes, but just with throwing guesses in there, we put a lot of random noise into it. And what we found is that we got 70 to 80% of the directions of interaction. So whether the species was going to go up or down, those still were correct, even though we put no abundances or interaction strengths in there. We just assigned those categories high, medium, or low. So we felt like this is reflecting stuff we've already seen with great data. So if you have a careful process for building a matrix for a new question, what you see is likely to be in the right direction. That makes sense. I'll hang out as long as y'all want.
It's a grad student.
Yeah, Jacob, yeah.
I have another question about the matrix. So the impacts between different plant species, are you able to model the competitive interactions or the impacts we see mediated between the consumers, through the consumers?
You can. So the way to build, and I'm happy to pull this thing up later and actually show you how to use it. When you build these, currently the only interaction that we can build is direct interactions between nodes, but anyone can have a direct interaction. So, I mean, you can imagine that the elk has one from hunters. It has a grazing interaction with every plant. You know, any of the predators on your secondary consumers line, everything they touch goes down. So if you want to build competition effects, you're just going to build nodes in between the species. And you can do that if that's the system that you want to build. What this then allows us to do, though, which is the power of it, is that indirect effects happen on their own. So you see up here this primary, secondary, tertiary, that doesn't actually need to be there. We're going to remove it. But when the model runs and you establish your interaction coefficients, you set up all your relationships and nodes, and then you move one of these sliders. I'm going to make a lot of snakes. The first thing that happens is all the direct relationships between snakes and everything else, they trigger. So they're going to eat rodents. The rodents go. The secondary thing is everything that happened to the rodents, whatever effect from their population change radiates out through the matrix. And then the tertiary is all of those go to wherever else they go. So you can end up with a situation where, you know, hunters are killing elk, and then plants are increasing because there's fewer elk. But there is no direct line between hunters and plants. That would make the matrix fail. So what this is designed to do is allow you to uncover indirect effects. This is probably going to make me look like a serious nerd. I like praying mantises. I think they're really cool. We got a bunch of them in Western Montana now. They're kind of this new big thing that everybody's seeing all over the place. So I built a little matrix with them and just tried to throw some numbers at it. A ton of research on them. They're great apex predators to use in experimental systems. And what I found after building the matrix and trying really hard to get the numbers right, is that if I make a ton of mantises, they eat the herbivorous insects, grasshoppers, hemipterans. They eat them like crazy. They don't really affect their population a whole lot. The only group that changes significantly is invertebrate predators. That would be the non-mantis predators. This is spiders and navids. And they go down because mantises eat them directly, but the indirect effect of eating their prey base also affects them.
Okay, well, let's thank Beau again.
Yes, I don't give short